everyone, and welcome to In Reality Lessons from Leaders on Entrepreneurs, the podcast from the School of Management at the New York Institute of Technology, where we explore real world insight from business leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Priscilla Hagen, an MBA candidate in business analytics here at New York Tech. In many of our past conversations on this podcast, we've explored how leaders build successful organizations using strategy, innovations, and culture. But today we're going to explore another critical leadership challenge. What happens when things go wrong and an organization suddenly finds itself in the middle of a crisis? Our guest today helps leaders navigate exactly those moments. Nathan Miller is the CEO and founder of Miller Inc., a strategic communications firm that advises corporations, public figures, nonprofits, and executives on storytelling, reputation management, and crisis communication. Earlier in his career, Nathan served as the chief speechwriter for the Israeli mission to the United Nations, where he helped craft messages in one of the most high pressure communication environments in the world. Nathan, welcome to In Reality.
So good to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you can be here with us and share your Nathan insights, beginning with your early career. Nathan, you began your career writing speeches at the United Nations, which is a very high
Good.
environment for communication. Can you share a moment from that experience that taught you something powerful about persuasion or communication that you still use today?
Absolutely. I can share I'll share a few moments from that. So for your viewers who aren't maybe necessarily familiar with this, although many will be, Israel's not exactly the most popular country at the UN. And so I got that job when I was 25 years old.
Yes.
Most people who were the speechwriters, for instance, the US speechwriter at the UN when I was there was 50 years old, had just left as the long career in journalism and politics, had spent at top news, really this scrappy kid that was going to figure it out. And I was the only native English language speaker in the mission. And there's a huge volume of speeches that are given at the United Nations in any given week. I was writing all the speeches and running all the communications and social media at that time, which was an emerging thing in 2013. 2010 is when I started. So a lot of different things on my plate, and it was a lot of trial by fire. So we had a lot of funny moments and interesting moments and challenging moments. I will say two things that I really learned. I worked for an incredible ambassador. I think he's one of Israel's greatest diplomats of this generation of recent memories. He's very funny, thoughtful, and the cardinal sin in our office was don't be boring. If I brought a speech in that he felt wasn't interesting or dynamic in some way, he would pretend like he's falling asleep and he would say, that's a snooze situation. We need to make it more interesting. So the first thing was in the UN environment, which is really, really boring. If you've ever sat through a lot of UN meetings, it's a lot of jargon, a lot of the same terms, people just repeating the same truisms to each other again and again, and they're very, very boring. He wanted to always stand out in every speech he gave. So he used a lot of humor. He would say things that would shock people, but they were funny. He would say, Bashar Assad, the ophthalmologist with a blind spot for terror. Because people loved the fact that Bashar Assad was an ophthalmologist. This was when the Syrian uprising was happening. Or he would say, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if rockets fall on your head, you have a right to defend yourself. Or things like that were very silly. And that doesn't work in every communications context. But in that context, people would specifically come to the UN to hear his speeches. The other diplomats would be there when he was going to speak, in part because they wanted to see what he was going to say, and because he was funny and he had that sense of humor. And he also understood very much how to create a metaphor, the power of creating a good metaphor and analogy. I was there when the Palestinians were bringing their UN statehood bid, which was a big thing. And we were trying to explain why the Palestinians needed Israel in order to have their own state, that it was a two-way street. So we were always thinking about metaphors that we could use from within the context of New York City, where people were living. He says they want to connect the West Bank and Gaza. It's like saying you want to go from the Bronx to Staten Island, you got to go through Manhattan, and you have to putting things in a context. And I learned it was very much a pressure cooker environment doing that early in my career. And I built all those skills through a lot of repetition and having to really think about how do you make a story really compelling in an environment that's pretty hostile without having the prerequisite credentials, let's say, and make it work and always perform.
That's fascinating. I was curious, how did you land the job in the first place? How were they able
How did
to?
they find me? It was
Yes,
that's
how did they?
also that's a crazy story. I went to grad school in public policy and I'd worked right after grad school in Brussels, actually, at a think tank there. I left that was like a fellowship and started a job in Los Angeles working in strategic communications. And I'd done that for a couple of years. I was 25. There was this kind of big email that they had sent out saying they were recruiting for this position. And I threw my hat in the ring and I thought there's no chance I'm going to get this job, but whatever. I sent a writing sample, something I'd published, and they got hundreds of resumes and applications. And the ambassador at the time liked my writing sample. I flew out to New York. Again, thought there's no way I'm going to get this job, but let's see it through. And then I ended up in the role and it totally changed my life. It was incredible.
Wow.
The other thing that I learned, because this is a podcast on entrepreneurship, right? A really important lesson I learned from the ambassador I worked for. Speech writing in a diplomatic environment is complicated. It's about the writing, and then there's a lot of other layers of politics,
Okay.
both in terms of your engagement with capital, how you're thinking about the political context of what you're writing, and then the internal politics of an office even. So I was often the low man on the totem pole. I didn't speak Hebrew when I started that job. And there was a lot of dynamics within like any diplomatic office, but in this one, the lawyer didn't get along with the political advisor, didn't get along with the security counselor. It was very challenging to do my job. And the first ambassador I worked for was an interim ambassador. He didn't really have the authority in the office. And so things would happen all the time where I would have to write my speeches very last minute. I wouldn't get the information I needed. It was very challenging to do the work. And the first speech I wrote for the ambassador I worked for the longest time, a guy named Ron Persor, Israel used to give every quarter called the Situation on the Middle East speech. And it was our big Security Council speech. That's where we had the most media attention. It was a very important speech. One of the diplomats I was working for who was really supposed to drive a lot of the substance of that speech would wait until the very last minute before he would tell me what was going to be in the speech because he didn't want to give his colleagues the opportunity to comment on the speech. But that put me in a really uncomfortable position. He would tell me what was going to be in the speech, and it would be like 7 o'clock. So it would be like 7 o'clock at night, and I'd have to turn in the speech by the end of the evening, and then it would go right to the ambassador, and then he'd give it. It would be the day before. And it was a totally horrible way to work, and we didn't get a great outcome as a result. But I remember, so the first time that happened, the new ambassador came in. He came to me, he said, I realize I have this speech tomorrow. Why haven't I seen my speech till now? And I said, well, I haven't heard from this other diplomat who's supposed to tell me. And he said, what? And he was shocked. And he was really unhappy with the first draft that we turned in. We ended up working till like 4 a.m. I remember I turned in the speech and he was great, but it was a very full contact, intense kind of thing. And he gave the speech and it went well. And then the next morning we all sat at the staff meeting and he pounded his fist on the table and he said, Nate is my speechwriter. When he speaks for me. He's like, I don't want to ever hear that you're not providing him with the information that he needs in order to do his job for me.
Did
And
that validate the work that you've done staying up all night to
and
write?
it's not just that, it totally changed the environment that I operated in. It really underscored the importance of when you have a team, having their back, both externally and internally, and making sure that they are comfortable and know that you're going to do what he demanded quite a lot for me. It was it's the most demanding boss I've ever had. Most demanding client I've ever had, I should say too. He really asked a lot, but you also knew that no matter what, he was going to have your back and he was going to make sure that you had the tools you needed to be successful, and he cared a lot. And he was just very, very, very warm and nurturing as a boss and a mentor. So for me, I really try to replicate that understanding as I think I have a team now of 25 plus people. I think about that model and how I want to be a leader and how I want people to understand. I'm going to hold you to a really high standard. We're going to have a really high standard for excellence, but you're going to have my support to do your job well. And we're going to have an environment that's going to nurture you. It's going to help you grow. And I think that leaders who learn that, it's a better way to live, but it's also a better way to run a business and have a healthy organization.
So do you consider that as a good training ground for what you're doing now, or the kind of leadership that you give to your?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, it was an interesting, not a traditional training ground. It was very intense and required an athleticism, is what I describe it as, like being able to quickly turn around a speech, adapt to events, work with other people to accomplish a goal. All of those things is really our business the same way. It's particularly our crisis business. And so there was no training like that. And so when I think about who I want to recruit to work in our team, I'm looking for people who have that resilience and who have experience that demonstrates the ability to navigate quickly on their feet through complexity, through nuance, and to work well with other people in that process.
You mentioned humor. People will show up to listen to the ambassador. So, what role does humor play in communication? Is it just entertainment and then everything?
It's such a valuable thing. It has to be properly deployed. First of all, in diplomacy, it's extremely important because so much of diplomacy is you're at the edges. People make policy and you're trying to figure out how you project, communicate, translate one country's policy to another. And those personal relationships that you make matter quite a bit. And humor is just a natural way that humans come together. It gets people to look differently at an issue. If it's deployed properly in communications, it can bring a bad idea to its logical conclusion to help people understand how bad the idea is. It can help people to just to pay attention, helps you stand out from a crowd. It's just a really natural thing that I think is really important to be able to deploy.
Would you find that people from different cultures have a different sense of humor, and how do you navigate thing, especially at the UN where everybody's from someplace else,
Right.
that these different backgrounds they may not get it?
It's a totally great point. So first of all, there's 7 languages that your speech is being simultaneously translated into at the UN. There's 7 official languages. So anytime you say hello, that's going to be translated 7 times through headphones to people so they can hear what's going on in real time. So all the intonation, the nuance, so much of humor is in those intangible things. It's not necessarily just the content itself. So you lose some of that in translation. And there's different communication styles. So something that was very interesting to me to observe at the UN, the Arabic or Russian communication styles are very different than what our style would be in English. Other cultures will repeat the same thing over and over and over again in different ways because there's like a notion that helps to prove the point. They're long and they go where I think the communications framework in America and the English language and the West, it tends to be a little more like make your big point, write a thesis, here's your support, go forward, but you don't have to keep looping back. And it's a little less circular. So the first time I would listen to speeches when I got there, I was like, this is kind of bizarre, but that's the way that different cultures operate. So I think the analogy with the UN, yeah, you have to really think about how is this going to land? Who do we care about hearing it? Sometimes you have a target audience and it's not everybody. They can get in their head. They know how it's going to play and they can play chess moving forward. Like if I say this, they're going to think this. And so a lot of that is how you translate it. I will say many of the big communications snafus, sometimes I get calls from reporters asking this brand did this or this. And a lot of times it's humor that didn't quite land or landed in the wrong way or was perceived in a certain way. And so you have to really have a great deal of humility about how something is going to land and also an ability to play out how this might land. Humor is a great tool in your toolbox, but it has to be deployed very effectively or it can be problematic.
Before we wrap up, Nathan has given us powerful insight into what makes communication effective. From clarity and audience awareness to the importance of standing out in even the most formal environments. But this is only part of the story. In the next episode, we go deeper into crisis leadership, how organizations respond when everything is on the line, why transparency can make or break a reputation, and what most leaders get wrong in the moments that matter most. Now, here are a few key lessons from this conversation. First, effective communication begins with understanding your audience. Great communicators don't just focus on what they want to say, they think carefully about how their message will be received. Second, clarity and simplicity are powerful. In an environment filled with noise and complexity, the ability to communicate in a clear and engaging way sets great leaders apart. Third, Communication is not just a technical skill, it's a leadership responsibility. Leaders who create space for strong ideas and support their teams ultimately produce more effective communication. And finally, standing out matters. As Nathan emphasized, in even the most formal and structured environments, being memorable and engaging can make all the difference. In reality, it's produced by the School of Management at the New York Institute of Technology. Special thanks to John Rebecki, founder and co-executive producer, Professor Deborah Kuhn, co-executive producer, Pathra Chandaraga, producer. This episode was edited with assistance from Claudia. I'm Priscilla Hagen, and thank you for listening to In Reality.